The crowd roared as Brian's ball soared through the air, cutting through the last light of the afternoon sun. My grip tightened around my drink as I watched it land just inches from the hole. A perfect approach. Brian had been struggling all day, missing easy putts and losing his usual swagger. But now, with the game on the line, he pulled off a miracle. The kind of shot every golfer dreams of, impossible, but there it was, happening right in front of us. I glanced over at Emma. Her eyes were glued to Brian. Her face lit up with a kind of admiration that twisted something inside me. She was smiling, no, beaming, as if she'd just witnessed something sacred. And maybe she had. To her, Brian wasn't just another pro, he was a legend, a man who played the game like it was an art form, and today, he just added another masterpiece to his gallery. I should have been cheering like everyone else. But all I could feel was this gnawing pit in my stomach. Emma leaned forward, clapping, her eyes following Brian as he walked off the green. Arms raised, soaking in the applause. I could see the glances exchanged between them, fleeting but unmistakable, the kind that speaks volumes without a word. I turned away, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. "Wasn't that incredible?" Emma asked, her voice breathless, almost starstruck. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Hell of a shot." I wanted to believe that was all it was, just admiration for a great player. But deep down, I knew better. Emma's been my wife for 8 years. I've seen her excited, I've seen her passionate, but this was different. She was captivated, and it wasn't just by the game. As we made our way back to the clubhouse, Emma kept glancing back, searching the crowd, probably hoping to catch another glimpse of Brian. I stayed quiet, watching her from the corner of my eye, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But the seed was planted. And it was already starting to grow. Emma and I met on the golf course. It was one of those perfect spring mornings where the air felt crisp. And the dew clung to the grass, sparkling in the early sun. She was working on her swing, struggling with her stance, and I offered a few pointers. She laughed, adjusted her grip, and nailed the next shot. That was Emma, quick to learn, quick to laugh. Golf was our thing, the glue that held us together even when everything else felt like it was unraveling. But lately, it was starting to feel like I was the only one holding on. It started small, missed tea times, late nights out with her friends, and the constant ping of her phone lighting up at odd hours. She'd always been social, but now it felt like she was slipping away. And then there was Brian. They'd met a few months ago at a charity tournament, and Emma had been drawn to him like a moth to a flame. At first, it seemed innocent enough. Emma was passionate about golf, and Brian was a rising star. They talked about the sport, shared tips, and even played a few rounds together. But I could sense it, the change in her, the way she spoke about him with that hint of something more. One night, Emma came home late, smelling like wine and expensive cologne, her cheeks flushed. She tried to play it off, saying she'd been out with some of the girls from the club. But the way she stumbled over her words told me otherwise. I asked if she'd seen Brian. She paused, just for a second, but it was enough. "No," she said, too quickly. "Just the girls." I let it slide, but the doubt was there festering. I tried to focus on work, on my own game, anything to keep my mind off the nagging feeling that something was wrong. But every time I saw her phone light up, every time she left the house without saying where she was going, it was like a knife twisting deeper. A few days later, we were at the driving range. Emma was distracted, barely listening as I talked about an upcoming tournament we'd planned to attend. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced down, her thumb hovering over the screen before she slid it back into her pocket. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "Yeah, just some club stuff," she replied, her tone distant. But I caught a glimpse of the name on her screen before she hid it away, Brian. I didn't say anything. I just nodded, watching her as she took her next shot, her focus anywhere but here. The ball sliced right, landing far off course. I knew the feeling. Emma was slipping, and I was losing her. But I wasn't about to go down without a fight. The day I finally confronted Brian wasn't planned. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, the kind we used to spend together on the course. But lately, Emma had been too busy or too distracted to join me. So, I found myself alone at the club, practicing my short game and trying to clear my head. I was lining up a putt when I saw them, Emma and Brian, at the far end of the range. She was laughing at something he'd said, her head thrown back, eyes sparkling. Brian leaned in closer, his hand casually brushing her arm as he adjusted her stance. They looked like they were sharing a private joke, something just for them. The kind of moment that used to be ours. I watched from a distance, the jealousy burning hotter with every second. I was about to leave when Brian noticed me. He straightened up, his face breaking into that trademark smirk, the kind that made him look so damn untouchable. "Alex," he called out, waving me over like we were old friends. I forced a smile and walked over, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hey, man," Brian said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Emma was just showing me a few of your tips. She says you've got a killer short game." I glanced at Emma, who quickly looked away, her cheeks flushing. "Yeah, she's picked up a few things," I said, my voice flat. We exchanged pleasantries, but my eyes never left Emma. She avoided my gaze, fiddling with her club, acting like this was just another casual meet-up. But it wasn't. I could feel the tension, thick and suffocating, hanging between us. I wanted to call them out, right then and there, but I knew it wasn't the time. "Not yet. So, Brian," I said, keeping my tone light, "I've been hearing some interesting things about your last tournament. Impressive stuff." Brian's smile faltered for just a second before he recovered, laughing it off. "Yeah, it was a good day. Got lucky, I guess." "Luck," I repeated, letting the word hang. "You know, it's funny how luck always seems to favor some players more than others." Emma shot me a warning look, but I ignored her. Brian just grinned, but there was a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "That's the game, right? You win some, you lose some." I nodded, pretending to be satisfied with his answer. But I'd seen enough. Brian was cocky, too sure of himself, and he had no idea what was coming. I turned to Emma, forcing myself to stay calm. "I'm heading out," I said, my voice tight. "I'll see you at home." Emma didn't say a word, just nodded as I walked away, feeling her eyes on my back the whole time. I knew she'd follow Brian anywhere, but now it was my turn to make a move. It wasn't long after the confrontation that I decided to dig deeper. Brian wasn't just some hotshot golfer, he was reckless, a man who pushed boundaries both on and off the course. I started asking around, using my connections, and talking to people who knew Brian better than he probably realized. What I found didn't surprise me, but it gave me exactly what I needed, a pattern of rule bending that went far beyond bad sportsmanship. There were rumors of bribes to caddies for insider information, quiet payoffs to cover up small infractions, and questionable connections that helped him secure favorable tee times in big tournaments. Brian played dirty, and everyone knew it, but no one had the guts to say it out loud. Not until now. I spent nights combing through tournament footage, watching Brian's matches frame by frame. The patterns were there, subtle hand signals to his caddy, unorthodox adjustments to his equipment, and suspiciously lucky shots that defied logic. It wasn't just skill, it was manipulation. And I had the receipts. The more I uncovered, the angrier I got. This wasn't just about Emma anymore. Brian was a fraud, a cheat hiding behind his cocky grin and flashy play style. And Emma had fallen for it, hook, line, and sinker. I wasn't just going to expose him, I was going to make sure he paid for every rule he broke. I reached out to a journalist I knew, Jake Walters, a guy who had made a career out of exposing the dirty secrets of professional sports. Jake was skeptical at first, but when I showed him the evidence, his eyes lit up. This was the kind of story that could ruin careers, and he was all in. "What's your angle, Alex?" Jake asked, his voice laced with curiosity. "Why now?" I shrugged, keeping my emotions in check. "I just think it's time someone told the truth about Brian." Jake nodded, scribbling down notes as we talked. He knew how to play the game, and how to keep things quiet until the right moment. We set the wheels in motion, planning to drop the story just before one of Brian's biggest tournaments of the year. It would be a perfect storm, timed to hit when it would hurt the most. As the days passed, I watched Emma grow more distant. She spent more time at the club and more time with Brian. But I didn't confront her. Not yet. I was waiting for the right moment, the perfect chance to pull the rug out from under both of them. I could feel the tension building, like the calm before a storm. Emma had no idea what was coming, and neither did Brian. But when the truth finally hit, it would be explosive. And I was ready to light the fuse. The morning of the tournament was tense. The sun was barely up, and already the course was buzzing with activity, golf carts humming, caddies hustling, and the soft murmur of spectators filing in. It was the kind of high-stakes atmosphere that Brian thrived in. He loved the attention, the pressure, the feeling of being on top of the world. But today was going to be different. I stood off to the side, hidden among the crowd, watching Brian go through his usual warm-up routine. Emma was there too, hovering near him like a shadow, whispering in his ear. She looked nervous, her smile forced, but Brian didn't seem to notice. He was too busy soaking up the spotlight, oblivious to the storm about to hit. I checked my phone. The article was set to drop any minute now. Jake had promised me it would be front-page news, a headline that no one in the golf world could ignore. I watched the seconds tick by, each one dragging like an eternity. And then, just as Brian was lining up his first shot, my phone buzzed. It was live. I couldn't help but smirk as I saw the headline, Pro Golfer Brian Cole accused of cheating and bribery, an investigation. The article detailed everything, the illegal hand signals, the suspicious wagers, and the backroom deals that had given Brian his edge. There were quotes from anonymous sources, tournament officials, and even a few former caddies who had finally decided to speak up. It was a brutal takedown, and it was everywhere within minutes. I glanced back at Brian. He was still focused on his shot, blissfully unaware. But then the whispers started. Caddies were checking their phones, players were looking over, and the buzz around the course shifted from excitement to something darker. I watched as one of Brian's sponsors approached him, phone in hand, his expression grim. Brian's confident posture faltered. He stepped aside, listening as the sponsor explained, his face going pale with every word. Emma moved closer, trying to comfort him, but Brian shoved her hand away, his eyes wild with anger and confusion. He snatched the phone, scrolling through the article, his jaw clenched tight. I could see the moment it hit him, the realization that he was exposed, his reputation shredded in front of everyone. Brian stormed off the course, shoving past cameras and reporters who were already circling like vultures. He barked at Emma, blaming her for dragging him out there when he should have stayed home. She looked helpless, caught between her loyalty to him and the unfolding chaos. I stayed in the background, watching it all unfold, feeling a twisted satisfaction as Brian's world crumbled around him. Emma spotted me through the crowd, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and fear. She knew I had something to do with this, but she didn't know how deep it went. Not yet. I gave her a small nod, just enough to let her know that I was behind the curtain, pulling the strings. Brian was done, and Emma was next. Emma didn't come home that night. I figured she'd gone to Brian's place, probably trying to comfort him or figure out some kind of damage control. But there wasn't much she could do. The article spread like wildfire, and by morning, every major sports outlet was running the story. Brian's sponsors had already begun pulling their deals, one after another, distancing themselves from the scandal as quickly as possible. His career was in freefall, and Emma was right in the middle of it. The next day, I found Emma in the kitchen, staring blankly at her coffee cup. She looked exhausted, her eyes red and puffy from crying. I sat down across from her, the silence stretching between us like a chasm. "You knew," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. I knew. "Why, Alex?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why would you do this?" I leaned back, letting her words hang in the air. "Because it's the truth, Emma. And someone had to say it." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You didn't just hurt Brian, you've hurt me too. Do you even care about that?" I stared at her, feeling a mix of anger and sadness that I couldn't quite untangle. "You made your choice, Emma. And now you're dealing with the fallout." Emma looked away, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She knew I was right, but that didn't make it any easier. The scandal had dragged her down with Brian, and now everyone at the club was talking. They whispered about how she'd been involved with him, how she'd turned a blind eye to his cheating. It didn't matter if it was true or not, reputations in the golf world were fragile, and Emma's was already on the brink. She tried to continue her normal routine, but every time she showed up at the course, the sideways glances and whispered comments made it impossible. Friends she'd known for years were suddenly distant, and her name was being dragged through the mud in the club's tight-knit social circles. Even her standing in the upcoming tournaments was questioned, with officials wondering if she'd been complicit in Brian's schemes. The final blow came when Emma was dropped from a major local tournament. Her application rejected under the vague pretense of preserving the integrity of the sport. She didn't say anything when she got the news, just sat there, staring at the email on her phone. But I knew it crushed her. One night, after days of silence, she finally spoke. "I can't stay here, Alex. Not after everything." I didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. Emma packed her bags, and just like that, she was gone. I watched from the doorway as she loaded up her car, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Never once looking back. I stood there for a long time after she left, feeling a hollow victory. I'd gotten what I wanted. Brian was exposed, his career in ruins, and Emma's affair was over. But as I stood in our empty house, the silence heavy around me, I realized I hadn't won anything at all. I'd just lost. The days after Emma left were strangely quiet. I thought I'd feel relieved, like a weight had finally been lifted off my shoulders. Instead, all I felt was emptiness. The house, once filled with her laughter and our shared routines, was now just a shell, silent, cold, and full of memories I couldn't escape. I went through the motions: work, golf, and the occasional drink with friends. But everything felt hollow. The club had become a minefield of whispers and judgmental looks. People who used to greet me with smiles now offered awkward nods, their eyes darting away like they were afraid of getting too close. I was no longer just Alex. I was the guy whose wife had run off with Brian Cole, the guy who had single-handedly blown up a rising star's career. One afternoon, I ran into Jake at the club. He was there for a meeting, probably sniffing around for his next big story. He spotted me and waved, walking over with a smug grin. "You're a hard man to reach these days," Jake said, slapping me on the back. "You see the latest fallout? Brian's team is crumbling. His caddy dropped him, and they're even talking about a ban." I nodded, barely listening. I'd already heard the news, it was all over the sports channels. Brian's name was being dragged through the mud, and every day brought another nail in the coffin of his career. But hearing it from Jake just felt cheap. Like I'd been part of something ugly and now had to live with it. "Thought you'd be happier," Jake continued, sensing my mood. "This is what you wanted, right?" I shrugged, staring out at the driving range. Brian's cheating was out there for the world to see, and Emma was gone. On paper, it was a win. But all I could think about was how much I'd lost in the process. The late nights plotting, the sleepless hours spent replaying every moment of Emma's betrayal. It had all led to this hollow victory. Jake looked at me, his grin fading. "Well, if you ever want to talk, or get another story rolling, you know where to find me." I watched him walk away, feeling more alone than ever. This wasn't the ending I'd pictured. I thought exposing Brian would be my triumph, a way to reclaim some control over a life that had spun out of my grasp. But now, all it felt like was a Pyrrhic victory, one that had cost me more than I was willing to admit. A few weeks passed, and I tried to settle into a new normal. I was adjusting, or at least pretending to. I'd thrown myself back into work, anything to keep my mind busy. But then, late one evening, I got a call that I didn't expect. It was Emma. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the answer button. I hadn't heard from her since she'd driven off that night, and part of me had hoped I never would. But curiosity got the better of me. I took a deep breath and answered. "Alex," she said, her voice sounding tired, almost broken. "Emma," I replied, keeping my tone flat. "What's going on?" There was a long pause on the other end, the kind that makes you wonder if the other person is about to hang up. Finally, she spoke, her voice wavering. I don't know why I'm calling. I guess I wanted to hear your voice." I didn't know how to respond to that. Emma's voice was tinged with regret, a stark contrast to the defiant tone she'd left with. I could hear the pain, the guilt, the heavy weight of everything that had gone wrong. "Are you okay?" I asked, more out of habit than genuine concern. She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "Not really. I've been staying with a friend, trying to figure things out. Everything's a mess." I let her talk, letting her words spill out. Emma told me how Brian had turned on her the moment his career imploded. He blamed her for everything, for the bad press, for the scandal, for the fallout with his sponsors. When the world turned on him, Brian showed his true colors, lashing out at anyone within reach. And Emma had been the closest target. "He's not who I thought he was," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I was so stupid, Alex. I thought I was in love, but it was all just a lie." Hearing her break down, I felt a flicker of the old connection, a reminder of the woman I'd once loved. But that connection was overshadowed by everything that had happened. The trust was gone, and I didn't know if it was something we could ever rebuild. "What do you want from me, Emma?" I finally asked, cutting through the emotional haze. She hesitated, struggling to find the right words. I don't know. I'm sorry. For everything. I know I can't fix what I did, but I needed you to know that. The apology hung between us, heavy and unresolved. Emma was asking for something I wasn't sure I could give: forgiveness, understanding, maybe even a second chance. But all I could think about was the months of suspicion, the lies, and the betrayal that had driven us apart. I don't know what you want me to say, I said, my voice hardening. You made your choices, Emma. And so did I. There was silence on the line, and I knew she was crying. It was the sound of a woman who had finally realized the cost of her mistakes. And maybe, in some small way, I felt sorry for her. But I also knew that sorry wasn't enough to fix what was broken. Emma cleared her throat, trying to steady her voice. I understand. I hope you can find some peace with all of this. I didn't respond. I didn't have the words. After a moment, Emma hung up, and I was left staring at the empty room around me, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. She was right about one thing: we both needed peace. But after everything we'd been through, I didn't know if either of us would ever find it. After Emma's call, I tried to bury myself in routine, hoping the structure would fill the empty spaces left behind. I went back to the club, practiced my swings, and even joined a few casual tournaments. But every time I stepped onto the course, I could feel the eyes on me, judging, speculating, and whispering about the drama that had unfolded. It was impossible to escape the shadow of everything that had happened. One afternoon, I was in the middle of a solo round when I ran into Mike, a longtime friend and fellow golfer. He'd been around since the beginning, watching from the sidelines as my life unraveled. Mike was one of the few who hadn't judged, who hadn't turned his back when things got messy. Mind if I join? Mike asked, already pulling out a club. Sure, I said, grateful for the company. We played in silence for a while, the only sounds being the soft thud of golf balls and the rustle of the trees. It was peaceful, almost therapeutic. But eventually, Mike broke the quiet, his tone cautious. How are you holding up? He asked, squinting at the fairway ahead. I shrugged, keeping my eyes on the ball. I'm managing. Mike nodded, taking his shot. I know things have been rough. The whole Brian and Emma thing. It's messed up, man. But you did what you had to do. I sighed, feeling the weight of his words. Did I? I thought exposing Brian would make things right, but now. I don't know. Mike looked at me, his expression thoughtful. You were hurting, Alex. Anyone would have done the same in your shoes. But you've got to find a way to move past it. It was good advice, the kind that was easy to give but hard to follow. I'd spent so long focused on revenge that I hadn't stopped to think about what came next. Now, with Emma gone and Brian's downfall complete, I was left grappling with the consequences of my actions. The anger that had fueled me was gone, replaced by a lingering emptiness I didn't know how to fill. Mike and I finished the round, and as we packed up our clubs, he clapped me on the back. You're a good guy, Alex. Don't let this define you. I watched him walk away, his words echoing in my mind. I wasn't sure what defined me anymore, but I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't keep living in the past. I needed to find a way to move forward, even if I wasn't sure what that looked like yet. A month after Emma's call, I got an unexpected email. It was from the club's board, inviting me to participate in a charity tournament they were organizing. It was a big event, with local celebrities, sponsors, and a sizable audience. I hadn't been part of anything that public since the whole scandal, and the thought of stepping back into the spotlight made me uneasy. But maybe that was exactly what I needed. On the day of the tournament, the weather was perfect, clear skies and a light breeze that made the course look like something out of a postcard. I showed up early, my nerves simmering beneath the surface. The clubhouse was buzzing with players, sponsors, and photographers, everyone eager for a day of competition and camaraderie. I spotted familiar faces in the crowd, including a few people who had kept their distance after the Brian scandal. Some nodded in acknowledgement, others pretended not to see me. But this time, I didn't care. I was here for me, not for them, not to prove anything. The tournament started, and I found myself paired with a few seasoned players, none of whom brought up the past. We played a clean round, the kind that reminded me of why I'd fallen in love with golf in the first place. The rhythm, the focus, the feeling of the club connecting perfectly with the ball. It was the closest thing to peace I'd felt in months. As we made our way through the back nine, I noticed a familiar figure standing near the 16th hole. Emma. She was leaning against a fence, watching quietly, her expression unreadable. She hadn't seen me yet, but I felt my heart skip a beat at the sight of her. I didn't know why she was there, maybe to watch, maybe for closure, or maybe she was just as lost as I was, searching for something familiar. I considered walking over and saying something, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I focused on my game, determined not to let her presence throw me off balance. On the 18th hole, I found myself with a tricky putt, the kind that required perfect precision. I could feel the pressure building, but for once, it didn't bother me. I took a deep breath, lined up my shot, and let it go. The ball rolled smoothly across the green, dropping into the cup with a satisfying click. The small crowd erupted in applause, and I allowed myself a smile. It wasn't about winning, it was about finding my footing again. I glanced back to where Emma had been standing, but she was gone. Maybe it was for the best. We both had our own paths to walk now, and this was my first step forward. As I walked off the course, I felt lighter. The pain, the betrayal, the anger, it was all still there, but it wasn't controlling me anymore. I was no longer defined by Emma's choices or Brian's downfall. I was just Alex, a guy who loved golf, who'd been knocked down but was finally finding the strength to get back up. The tournament ended, and I drove home feeling hopeful for the first time in a long while. I didn't know what the future held, but for now, that was okay. I was ready to face whatever came next, one swing at a time. The charity tournament had given me a glimpse of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. I started showing up at the club more regularly, reconnecting with old friends, and getting back into the rhythm of the game. It was like waking up after a long, restless sleep. The whispers hadn't completely died down, but I didn't care as much anymore. I was there to play, to rebuild, and to move on. One afternoon, as I was wrapping up a practice session, I saw someone I never expected to see again: Brian. He was standing near the driving range, talking to a few people. His once cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by something almost unrecognizable: humility, maybe, or just exhaustion. He looked thinner, his hair unkempt, like someone who had spent too much time battling his own demons. I hadn't spoken to Brian since the day the article dropped. Seeing him now, so diminished, stirred something complicated inside me. I watched as he struggled with his swing, each hit lacking the sharp precision that used to define him. The crowd around him was sparse, made up of a few curious onlookers and a couple of guys who clearly weren't impressed. I approached cautiously, not sure what to expect. Brian glanced up, meeting my eyes with a look of surprise. For a moment, we just stood there, two men whose lives had collided and fallen apart in ways neither of us could have predicted. "Alex," Brian finally said, his voice rough. "Didn't think I'd see you here." "Same," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "What brings you back?" Brian shrugged, wiping sweat from his brow. "Trying to get back into the swing of things. It's harder than I thought." There was a painful honesty in his words that caught me off guard. Brian was a guy who'd spent his whole life acting like he was untouchable, and now he was dealing with the fallout in a very public way. I thought about all the anger that had driven me to expose him. The way I'd convinced myself that ruining him would make everything better. But looking at him now, struggling to find his place, I felt no satisfaction. "Golf's like that," I said. "It doesn't let you hide." Brian nodded, staring out at the range. "Yeah, it doesn't." He paused, then looked at me, the weight of his actions clear in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Alex, for everything. I never meant for it to go this way." His apology hung between us, raw and unexpected. I didn't know if it was enough, or if it could ever be, but hearing him own up to his mistakes was something I never thought I'd get. I wasn't sure if I could forgive him, but I also realized that holding onto my anger wasn't doing me any favors. "We all messed up," I said, my voice calm. "But it's done now. Time to figure out what's next." Brian looked relieved, like he'd been carrying that guilt for too long. We didn't shake hands or make any grand gestures of reconciliation. We just stood there, two flawed men trying to pick up the pieces. As I walked away, I felt lighter, like maybe I was finally ready to let go of the past. Emma's absence was still a constant presence in my life, a lingering ghost that haunted the empty spaces of our home. But I'd started to accept it, to see it as part of a chapter that had closed. I focused on the future, putting my energy into golf, my work, and finding a new sense of normal. Every day felt like a step in the right direction, even if some steps were smaller than others. One morning, as I was sifting through the mail, I found an envelope addressed to me with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note from Emma. It was short, barely a page, but every word carried the weight of our shared history. She wrote about how she was taking time to figure herself out, and how she'd started seeing a therapist to deal with the fallout of everything that had happened. Emma didn't ask for forgiveness, and she didn't try to explain away her actions. She simply acknowledged the pain she'd caused and thanked me for the years we'd spent together. Even if they hadn't ended the way either of us had planned. Whatever happens, I hope you find happiness, Alex, she wrote. You deserve that. I set the letter down, feeling a mix of emotions, sadness, relief, and maybe even a little bit of hope. Emma was finding her way, just as I was finding mine. We were different people now, shaped by the mistakes and regrets that had pulled us apart. But there was no bitterness left, only a quiet understanding that sometimes things break and don't get put back together. And that's okay. I folded the letter and tucked it away in a drawer, not because I needed a reminder of Emma, but because it was a symbol of closure. The door had been closed, but it didn't have to be locked forever. Later that day, I decided to head back to the club. There was a new tournament coming up, and for the first time in a long while, I felt ready to compete without the weight of the past dragging me down. After her third miss, Jen looked ready to give up. I walked over, handing her a new ball. Try this, I said, positioning her hands on the club. Relax your grip and just focus on the rhythm. Don't overthink it. She nodded, taking a deep breath before lining up her shot. The ball flew straight, landing neatly on the fairway. Jen's face lit up, and the small victory reminded me of why I loved teaching so much, the joy of helping someone discover their own potential. The tournament ended, and while Mike and I didn't win, we played a solid round. But it wasn't about the score, it was about reconnecting with the game in a way that felt pure and uncomplicated. As we headed back to the clubhouse, I felt lighter, unburdened by the weight of the past. Mike clapped me on the back, grinning. You've still got it, Alex. Ever think about getting back into the swing of things more seriously? I laughed, shaking my head. I think I'm good right where I am, Mike. But today was fun. We parted ways, and I took a moment to look out over the course. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue across the greens. It was a perfect ending to a day that felt like a small but meaningful triumph. As I drove home, I thought about the twists and turns my life had taken, the highs, the lows, and everything in between. There were still things I was figuring out, still pieces of myself that were healing. But I'd learned that life, much like golf, wasn't about getting everything perfect. It was about showing up, taking each swing as it came, and finding joy in the journey. I pulled into my driveway, feeling content. I wasn't the same man who'd been consumed by betrayal and revenge. I was Alex, still flawed, still learning, but finally at peace with where I was. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like the future was wide open, full of possibility. Maybe I'd keep teaching, maybe I'd compete again, or maybe I'd find something entirely new. Whatever came next, I was ready. One day, one swing, one moment at a time. Months passed, and life continued to take me in unexpected directions. I found myself more involved with the youth golf program, not just as a coach, but as a mentor. Each week, I saw kids like Sam improve, not just in their swings but in their confidence. I realized that these moments, the little victories, the breakthroughs, meant more to me than any trophy ever could. One day, while helping the kids set up for a junior tournament, Karen, the program director, approached me with a proposal. We're expanding the program, she said, smiling. We want to create more opportunities for kids who can't afford golf lessons. I was hoping you'd consider coming on board full-time. Her words caught me off guard. I'd been volunteering, enjoying the freedom of doing something meaningful without the pressures of a full-time job. But the idea of making a real impact on these kids' lives, of being part of something bigger, was tempting. I don't know, Karen, I said thoughtfully. I've never seen myself as a full-time coach. You've got a gift, Alex, she replied, her tone sincere. Not just for the game, but for connecting with these kids. They look up to you. We could really use someone like you. I took a few days to think it over. I went back and forth, weighing the pros and cons. But every time I pictured myself anywhere else, it just didn't feel right. This wasn't just about teaching golf, it was about being part of a community. About giving back in a way that mattered. So, I took the leap. I joined the program full-time, diving into the work with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. As the new season kicked off, we hosted a charity event to raise funds for the expanded program. It was a beautiful spring day, and the turnout was better than we could have hoped for. Parents, local businesses, and even a few professional players showed up to support the cause. I was busy helping set up when I saw a familiar face in the crowd, Emma. She stood near the registration table, looking a little lost but still as composed as ever. It had been a long time since we'd seen each other, and I wasn't sure what to expect. Part of me had prepared for this moment, but the reality of it felt different. I approached her, and she turned, offering a tentative smile. "Hey, Alex." "Emma," I nodded, keeping my voice calm. "Didn't expect to see you here. I heard about the event and wanted to stop by. I think what you're doing here is really great," she said, her tone genuine. We stood there for a moment, the weight of our shared past lingering between us. It wasn't awkward, but there was a quiet understanding, a recognition of everything we'd been through and how far we'd come since then. "How have you been?" I asked, genuinely curious. Emma sighed, her expression softening. "Better. I've been focusing on my career and working on myself. Therapy's been eye-opening. I'm trying to make peace with a lot of things." I nodded, appreciating her honesty. "That's good to hear. I'm glad you're doing okay." She glanced at the kids running around, then back at me. "You look happy, Alex. I haven't seen you like this in a long time." I smiled, feeling the truth of her words. "I am. This," I said, gesturing to the course, the kids, and the event around us. "This has been good for me." Emma reached into her bag, pulling out a small donation envelope. I wanted to contribute. "It's not much, but I hope it helps." I took the envelope, touched by the gesture. "Thank you. It means a lot." We talked for a few more minutes, catching up in a way that felt surprisingly easy. There were no apologies, no rehashing of old wounds. Just two people acknowledging that they'd once meant everything to each other and that now, they were in different, healthier places. As the event continued, I watched Emma leave, feeling a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. It wasn't about getting back together or even rekindling a friendship. It was about finally letting go, about being able to wish each other well and move forward. The day was a huge success. We raised enough money to fund the program's expansion, and the kids were thrilled with the support. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, I took a moment to stand at the edge of the course, watching the last of the day's light fade. Mike joined me, handing me a drink. "Not bad, huh?" "Not bad at all," I said, clinking my glass against his. We stood in comfortable silence, two old friends soaking in the moment. For the first time in a long time, I felt like everything was exactly as it should be. I didn't need the big wins or the perfect story, I just needed this, the simple, quiet satisfaction of knowing I was right where I was meant to be. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill my lungs. The past was behind me, and the future felt wide open. Whatever came next, I was ready. I wasn't defined by my mistakes, my losses, or even my victories. I was just Alex, a man who'd learned to embrace the ups and downs, one day at a time. As I left the course that evening, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And that was more than enough.